Some secrets are buried so deep that even the grave can't hold them. High in the windswept peaks of Cedar Ridge, Montana, where October snow falls like forgotten promises, Evelyn Cross pressed her face against the frosted cabin window and wondered if she was losing her mind. For 28 years, she'd lived as her mother's shadow, never kissed, never touched, never allowed to exist beyond their isolated cottage. Now, trapped by a blizzard in the home of Daniel Morrison, a mountain man whose gentle hands told stories his scarred lips wouldn't speak, she was discovering what it meant to be alive. But the newspaper clipping she'd found tucked behind his medicine cabinet made her blood run cold. There, in black and white, was her own obituary dated 15 years ago, and beneath it, another death notice. Daniel Morrison, killed in a cabin fire in 2003. Were they both ghosts learning to love in a world that had already buried them? Or was something far more sinister hiding in the mountain mist, waiting to reclaim what it had lost? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The clipping trembled between Evelyn's fingers as she read her own death notice for the third time. Evelyn Cross, 13th, beloved daughter of Margaret Cross, perished in a house fire on October 15, 2008. Services will be held. The words blurred as her hands shook. 13. She'd been 13 when the world thought she died. The same year her mother had suddenly decided they needed to move for a fresh start to their isolated cottage on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge. The same year her mother's episodes had grown worse when the paranoid whispers about dangerous people and protecting what's precious had begun. Behind her, Daniel Morrison moved through his cabin with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to solitude. She could hear him stoking the fire, the soft clink of metal against stone, but she couldn't bring herself to turn around. How do you look at a man whose obituary you've just discovered? How do you explain that you've apparently been dead for 15 years? The storm's getting worse, Daniel said, his voice carrying the rough warmth of wood smoke. You shouldn't try to make it home tonight. Home. The word felt foreign on her tongue now. Was the cottage where she'd spent 15 years of her supposedly dead life even really home? Or had it been something else entirely? A prison, a hiding place, a tomb for the living? Evelyn folded the clippings with trembling fingers and slipped them into her coat pocket. She needed time to think, to understand what this meant. But first, she needed to get through this night without falling apart completely. I should call my mother, she said, finally turning toward him. She'll be worried. Daniel paused in his work, firelight dancing across the planes of his face. In the golden glow, his scars seemed less pronounced, and she could see something that might have been concern flickering in his dark eyes. Phone lines are down. Have been since the storm started. Of course they were. Nothing about this night was going according to plan. She'd only come up the mountain to return the library books he'd borrowed, a simple errand that her mother had reluctantly agreed to after weeks of Evelyn's gentle persistence. Just there and back, Margaret Cross had said, wringing her hands. Don't talk to anyone. Don't linger. You know how dangerous it is when people notice you. People noticing her. Another piece of a puzzle Evelyn was only now beginning to see the edges of. You're shaking, Daniel observed, setting down the poker and taking a step toward her. Are you cold? She wasn't cold. Despite the blizzard raging outside, his cabin was warm and welcoming in a way her own home had never been. Thick wool rugs covered rough-hewn floors and books lined shelves built into every available wall space. It was the kind of place she'd dreamed about during long, lonely evenings, a sanctuary where someone could simply exist without fear. But she was shaking, trembling from the inside out, as everything she'd believed about her life crumbled like autumn leaves. I'm fine, she lied, wrapping her arms around herself. It's been a strange day. Daniel studied her with those two knowing eyes, and she had the unsettling feeling that he could see straight through her careful composure to the panic clawing at her chest. You don't have to pretend with me, Evelyn. The way he said her name, gentle, without the sharp edge of worry that always colored her mother's voice when she spoke it, made something crack open inside her chest. When was the last time someone had said her name like she was a person rather than a problem to be solved or a treasure to be hidden? "How long have you lived here?" she found herself asking, desperate to change the subject from her own unraveling. "Long enough," he said, which wasn't really an answer. He moved to the kitchen area, pulled down 2 mugs from a shelf. "Coffee? Or something stronger?" "Coffee's fine." She watched him work, noting the careful way he held his scarred hands, the practiced economy of his movements. "Do you ever get lonely?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, too honest and too revealing. But Daniel didn't seem bothered by her boldness. "Lonely's different up here," he said, spooning coffee into an old metal percolator. "It's quiet, but it's honest. Not like the loneliness you feel in a crowd." Evelyn knew exactly what he meant. She'd spent her entire adult life surrounded by her mother's suffocating presence, yet she'd never felt more alone. At least Daniel's solitude was chosen. Outside, the wind howled like something wild and hungry, rattling the windows and sending snow spiraling past the glass. She should be terrified, trapped in a strange man's cabin during a blizzard with newspaper clippings in her pocket that suggested her entire life was built on lies. Instead, for the first time in 2008 years, Evelyn Cross felt like she might finally be somewhere she belonged, even if that somewhere was inhabited by a man who was supposed to be dead. The coffee was stronger than anything Evelyn had ever tasted, bitter and real in a way that made her mother's carefully measured portions seem like pale imitations. She wrapped her hands around the chipped ceramic mug, letting the heat seep through her fingers as she tried to imagine explaining this night to Margaret Cross. "I was trapped in a blizzard with a dead man, Mother. We drank coffee and talked about loneliness while I discovered I've been legally deceased for 15 years. How was your evening?" The absurdity of it should have made her laugh, but instead she found herself studying Daniel's cabin with new eyes, cataloguing the details of a life lived completely outside the suffocating boundaries of her own existence. Books everywhere, not just the carefully curated collection of appropriate literature her mother allowed, but everything from dog-eared paperback mysteries to leather-bound classics to field guides filled with pressed flowers and handwritten notes in the margins. "You read a lot," she observed, grateful for neutral ground. "Not much else to do up here when the snow comes." Daniel settled into the chair across from her, his own coffee steaming between his scarred hands. "You work at the library." It wasn't a question, and she wondered how he knew. Cedar Ridge was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, but her mother had always been careful to keep Evelyn invisible, forgettable. The dutiful daughter who helped with the books but never stayed long enough for conversation, never attended town events or church socials or any of the 100 small gatherings that made up the fabric of normal life. 3 days a week, she said. Monday, Wednesday, Friday. The routine that had defined her entire adult existence. Up at 6 to help her mother with breakfast and morning medications. 45 minutes at the library, carefully supervised by Mrs. Henderson, who'd known Margaret Cross since childhood and treated Evelyn like a delicate artifact that might shatter if handled too roughly. Home by noon for lunch and an afternoon of tending to her mother's endless needs, organizing pills, managing appointments with the traveling doctor who made monthly visits, reading aloud from approved books while Margaret worked on her endless obsessive quilts. Dinner at 5:30 sharp, evening medication at 7, lights out by 9 because her mother couldn't sleep if there was any noise in the house, any suggestion that the world beyond their walls still existed. 28 years old, and her life fit into a schedule rigid enough for a psychiatric ward. "Do you like it?" Daniel asked. "Working with books?" The question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked her what she liked, what she wanted, what dreams might exist beneath the careful surface of her prescribed existence. Her mother certainly never asked. Margaret Cross lived in a perpetual state of crisis management, too consumed with protecting her daughter from unnamed threats to consider that Evelyn might have preferences, desires, an inner life that extended beyond gratitude for being kept safe. "I love the stories," she said quietly, surprising herself with the admission. "Sometimes I'll read the first chapter of something while I'm shelving, and I'll spend weeks thinking about what might happen next, making up my own endings." "What kind of endings do you make up?" The firelight flickered across his face, and she found herself really looking at him for the first time since she'd stumbled into his cabin. The scars on his hands extended up his forearms, disappearing beneath the rolled sleeves of his flannel shirt. Old burns, she thought, remembering the newspaper clipping about the fire that had supposedly killed him. But there was something else in his features, something that made her think he'd been handsome once, before whatever had happened to reshape his face with pain. Happy ones, mostly, she admitted. Adventures where people escape and find something better. Love stories where... She trailed off, heat rising in her cheeks. Where what? Where people choose each other, instead of being trapped together by circumstance or duty or... She gestured helplessly, unable to name the invisible threads that bound her to her mother's illness, her mother's fears, her mother's version of love that felt more like drowning than devotion. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, studying her over the rim of his coffee mug. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the cabin, but inside, the silence felt companionable rather than oppressive. "What would you do," he said finally, "if you could write your own ending?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge, like a door opening onto a room she'd never been allowed to enter. Evelyn thought about the newspaper clippings in her pocket, about the life that had continued without her while the world believed she was dead. Somewhere out there, people her age were building careers, falling in love, making mistakes and learning from them, living lives entirely of their own choosing. She'd never even been kissed. The thought came unbidden, shameful and true. 28 years old, and she'd never felt another person's lips against hers, never known the weight of someone else's hand in her hair, or the wild flutter of a heart that beat in rhythm with someone else's desire. "I don't know," she whispered, but the words tasted like the first lie she'd ever told herself. She knew exactly what she'd write. Daniel set down his mug with deliberate care, the soft clink of ceramic against wood unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. "You do know," he said quietly. "You're just afraid to say it out loud." The words hung between them like a struck bell, reverberating through Evelyn's chest with an intensity that made her breath catch. He was right. God help her, he was absolutely right, and the acknowledgement of it felt like stepping off a cliff into empty air. She opened her mouth to deny it, to retreat back into the safe territory of polite deflection when a sound outside made them both freeze. Not the wind. Evelyn had grown accustomed to its relentless howling over the past few hours. This was different, mechanical, growing closer. "Snowmobile," Daniel said, rising from his chair with a fluid grace that belied his size. The easy warmth that had settled over their conversation vanished, replaced by something sharp and alert. "You expecting someone?" Evelyn's blood turned to ice. There was only one person who would brave a blizzard to find her, only one person who knew she'd come up the mountain tonight. "My mother," she whispered, and the words tasted like panic. Daniel moved to the window, pulling back the heavy curtain just enough to peer out into the storm. "She knows where you are?" "She knows I came to return your books." Evelyn was already on her feet, her mind racing through the implications. Margaret Cross, who hadn't left their cottage in 3 years without extreme duress, had somehow managed to follow a snowmobile trail up a mountain in a blizzard. The level of desperation, or determination, that would require made Evelyn's stomach clench with familiar dread. The engine sound grew louder, then cut off abruptly. In the sudden quiet, Evelyn could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. "Evelyn!" Her mother's voice pierced the storm, sharp with a particular brand of hysteria that meant someone would pay dearly for this disruption to the careful order of their lives. "Evelyn, I know you're in there. Come out this instant." Daniel let the curtain fall and turned toward her, and she saw something in his expression that made her chest tighten. Not surprise or irritation at the interruption, but a kind of grim resignation, as if he'd been waiting for this moment, dreading it. "She can't see you," Evelyn said urgently, though she wasn't entirely sure why. She can't handle unexpected people. It makes her episodes worse." Even as she said it, she realized how it sounded. A grown woman making excuses for her mother's mental illness, preparing to manage another crisis instead of living her own life. But the habits of 28 years were carved deep into her bones, and Margaret Cross's S-voice outside was already taking on the brittle edge that preceded a complete breakdown. "Evelyn Cross, you get out here right now. Do you have any idea what you've put me through? The worry, the fear." The voice was closer now, probably at the base of the porch steps. "I had to borrow Jim Hendrix's snowmobile. I had to talk to a stranger, explain myself to him. You know what that does to me." The guilt hit Evelyn like a physical blow, exactly as it was designed to do. Her mother had left the safety of their cottage, had forced herself to interact with someone outside their tiny, controlled world, all because Evelyn had failed to come home on schedule. The weight of it settled over her shoulders like a familiar yoke. But beneath the guilt, something else stirred, something that felt dangerously like anger. "How did she even know to come here?" Daniel asked quietly. "If she's as isolated as you say, I don't know." But even as Evelyn said it, pieces began clicking into place. The way her mother had reluctantly agreed to let her make this trip. The casual questions about which route she planned to take, how long it would take, when exactly she'd be home. Margaret Cross, who claimed to be too fragile for the outside world, had somehow managed to track down a snowmobile and navigate mountain roads in a blizzard, unless she'd been planning for this possibility all along. "Evelyn!" The voice was at the door now, accompanied by sharp, demanding knocks. "I'm not leaving without you. I'll stand out here all night if I have to." Daniel moved toward the door, and panic shot through Evelyn like lightning. "Don't," she said, catching his arm. "Please. You don't understand what she's like when she's upset." His scarred hand covered hers where it gripped his sleeve, warm and steady and impossibly reassuring. "What are you afraid will happen?" The question was simple, but it cut straight to the heart of everything Evelyn had never allowed herself to examine. What was she afraid of? Her mother's tears, her accusations, the guilt that would follow any assertion of independence? Or was she afraid of something else entirely? Afraid of what she might choose if she truly believed she had the right to choose at all? Outside, Margaret Cross began to cry. The sound of her mother's tears cut through Evelyn like a blade, sharp and familiar and devastating in its effectiveness. 28 years of conditioning kicked in with brutal efficiency, the immediate need to soothe, to apologize, to make whatever was wrong right again, regardless of the cost to herself. "I have to go to her," Evelyn said, already pulling away from Daniel's touch, but his fingers tightened gently around hers. "Do you?" His voice was quiet, steady as bedrock. "Or is that just what you've been taught to believe?" The question stopped her cold. Through the door, Margaret Cross's sobs grew louder, more theatrical, punctuated by gasped words about abandonment and betrayal and the cruelty of ungrateful daughters. Evelyn had heard this symphony 1,000 times before, whenever she stayed too long at the library, whenever she'd mentioned wanting to attend a town function, whenever she'd shown any sign of existing as something other than an extension of her mother's will. But tonight, with newspaper clippings burning like secrets in her pocket, and Daniel's scarred hand anchoring her to something real and solid, the familiar melody sounded different. Calculated. Performed. "She's genuinely upset," Evelyn said, but her voice lacked conviction. "When she gets like this, she might hurt herself." Has she ever actually hurt herself, or just threatened to? The distinction hit Evelyn like a slap. She opened her mouth to defend her mother, to list the countless crises she'd prevented through vigilance and sacrifice, but the words wouldn't come, because when she really thought about it, when she pushed past the dramatic threats and manipulative tears, Margaret Cross had never actually harmed herself. She'd simply wielded the possibility like a weapon, training her daughter to dance to the rhythm of her emotional demands. "Evelyn!" Her mother's voice rose to a wail. "Please, I can't breathe. The cold, the stress, my heart." The heart condition. Another tool in Margaret's arsenal, though 3 different doctors had confirmed it was anxiety, not a physical ailment. But it worked every time, sending Evelyn into a spiral of guilt and terror that made rational thought impossible. This time, though, something in Evelyn resisted. Maybe it was the warmth of Daniel's cabin, so different from the sterile control of her home. Maybe it was the way he'd asked what she wanted, as if her desires mattered. Or maybe it was simply that she'd spent the evening glimpsing a version of herself that existed beyond the narrow confines of duty and fear. "What if I don't go?" she whispered, the words feeling like blasphemy. "What if I just stayed here until morning?" Daniel's thumb brushed across her knuckles, a gentle encouragement that made her heart skip. "What do you think would actually happen?" Evelyn closed her eyes and tried to imagine it. Her mother would rage and weep and threaten, but eventually what? Margaret Cross was a master manipulator, but she was also a survivor. She'd managed to acquire a snowmobile and navigate a blizzard to get here. She could certainly manage to get herself home safely. But the thought of defying her, of choosing her own comfort over her mother's demands, felt impossible. Foreign. Like trying to breathe underwater or fly without wings. "I can't," she said, and the words tasted like defeat. "You don't understand. She's been through so much. Lost so much. I'm all she has." "What have you lost?" Daniel asked quietly. The question hit her like a physical blow. What had she lost? Everything. Friends, career, romance, independence. 28 years of experiences sacrificed on the altar of her mother's alleged fragility. But admitting that felt like betraying the woman who'd raised her, who'd claimed every sacrifice was made from love. "She needs me," Evelyn said instead, falling back on the familiar justification. "Maybe. But what do you need?" Outside, Margaret's sobs had taken on the edge of genuine panic, the kind that would escalate into hyperventilation if left unchecked. Evelyn could picture her perfectly, small and fragile in the storm, wrapped in the ancient coat she wore for emergencies, her face blotchy with tears and cold. But she could also picture another scene, herself curled up by Daniel's fire, talking through the night about books and dreams and all the endings she'd never dared to imagine, waking up in a place where her presence was wanted rather than required, discovering what it felt like to be chosen instead of trapped. The longing was so sharp it stole her breath. "I need her to be okay," Evelyn said finally, but even she could hear how hollow it sounded. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the firelight. "What if her being okay doesn't have to cost you your life?" The words hung between them like a bridge to somewhere Evelyn had never been allowed to go. Outside, Margaret Cross continued her performance, but for the first time in 28 years, her daughter hesitated at the sound. And in that hesitation, something dangerous bloomed, the possibility that love and duty weren't the same thing after all. The silence stretched between them like a held breath, fragile and trembling with possibility. Outside, Margaret's sobs reached a crescendo before dissolving into harsh, theatrical coughing. The sound Evelyn had learned meant the performance was shifting tactics, preparing for a new angle of attack. But this time, instead of rushing toward the familiar panic, Evelyn found herself stepping back from it. The distance was tiny, barely perceptible, but it felt monumental, like the first crack in a dam that had held for decades. "I can't live like this anymore," she whispered, the words escaping before she could call them back. The admission hung in the air between her and Daniel, raw and terrifying and true. "I can't keep pretending that this is normal, that this is love." Daniel's scarred hand was still covering hers, steady and warm, anchoring her to this moment of dangerous clarity. "Then don't." Such simple words, such an impossible proposition. But if something happens to her, something's already happening to you. His voice was quiet but uncompromising. Every day you stay, something inside you dies a little more. How much of yourself are you willing to sacrifice for someone who refuses to get the help she actually needs? The truth of it hit her like a physical blow. Because that was what this really was, wasn't it? Not love, not protection but enablement. For 28 years, she'd been cushioning her mother from the natural consequences of her choices, making it possible for Margaret to avoid dealing with her illness while claiming to be its victim. Outside, the coughing stopped abruptly, replaced by an ominous silence that Evelyn recognized with sinking dread. The calm before the storm. Margaret was regrouping, preparing for the final assault. When it came, her mother's voice was small, broken, barely audible through the door. "Evelyn, sweetheart, I'm sorry. I know you're upset with me. I know I've been difficult lately. But I'm so scared out here, and I can't feel my fingers anymore. Could you please come home with me? We can talk about everything tomorrow, I promise." The manipulation was so elegant, so perfectly calibrated, that Evelyn almost admired it. The false humility, the manufactured vulnerability, the promise of future consideration that would never materialize. Margaret Cross was a master craftsman when it came to emotional warfare, but for the first time in her life, Evelyn could see the strings. "No," she said quietly, and the word fell into the cabin like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything she'd believed about herself. Daniel's fingers tightened around hers, offering silent support for the impossible thing she was doing. "No," she said again, louder this time, and felt something inside her chest crack open, not breaking, but blooming. "I'm staying here tonight, Mother. I'll come home in the morning when the storm passes." The silence that followed was so complete that even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then Margaret's voice returned, no longer broken or vulnerable, but sharp as winter steel. "You ungrateful little bitch." The venom in those words would have sent Evelyn scrambling to the door in apology just hours before. But now, with the artificial sweetness stripped away, she could hear what lay beneath, not grief or fear or genuine need, but fury at losing control. "If you stay there tonight, don't bother coming home at all," Margaret continued, her voice rising with each word. 28 years I've given you. 28 years of my life sacrificed to keep you safe. And this is how you repay me? By whoring yourself out to some mountain hermit?" Evelyn flinched, as if she'd been slapped, but Daniel stepped closer, his presence a wall between her and the poison being hurled through the door. "She doesn't mean that," Evelyn said automatically, but the words felt hollow. "She's just upset. She's not thinking clearly." "She knows exactly what she's saying," Daniel said quietly. "And so do you." He was right. Margaret Cross had revealed herself completely, stripping away 28 years of careful manipulation to show the calculating mind beneath. The woman who claimed to be too fragile for the outside world had somehow tracked down a snowmobile in the middle of the night. The mother who professed to love her daughter above all else had just called her a whore for choosing one night of independence. The engine roared to life outside, cutting through Evelyn's thoughts like a chainsaw. Through the window, she caught a glimpse of the snowmobile's headlights sweeping across the cabin as Margaret turned it around with expert precision, hardly the actions of someone too delicate for the real world. Then the light was gone, and the sound of the engine faded into the storm, leaving Evelyn alone with the choice she'd made and the man who'd helped her make it. She was shaking, she realized. Not from cold, but from the enormity of what had just happened. For the first time in her adult life, she'd chosen herself over her mother's demands. The bridge to her old life wasn't just crossed, it was burning behind her. "There's no going back now," she whispered. Daniel's scarred hand found her face, gentle as prayer. "Would you want to?" Looking into his eyes, Evelyn knew the answer with absolute certainty. Whatever came next, whatever consequences awaited her in the morning, she was finally, truly alive. "No," she breathed, and meant it completely. "I'm exactly where I want to be." The silence that followed Evelyn's declaration felt sacred, like the hush inside a cathedral where confessions had been spoken and absolution granted. But as the minutes ticked by and the reality of her choice settled over her like snow, the weight of what she'd done began to crystallize into something harder, more frightening than the euphoric certainty of moments before. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question carried more than she could articulate. What happened to a woman who just severed the only relationship that had defined her existence? What happened to someone who'd never learned how to be alone, how to make decisions, how to exist without the constant backdrop of another person's needs? Daniel's hand was still cupping her face, his thumb tracing a gentle path along her cheekbone. Now you figure out who you are when no one's watching. The concept was so foreign it made her dizzy. Who was she without her mother's demands to structure her days, her crises to navigate, her approval to seek? Evelyn Cross, dutiful daughter, was the only identity she'd ever known. The idea of existing beyond that narrow definition felt like stepping off the edge of the world. I don't know how, she admitted, the confession scraping her throat raw. I don't know how to be anything else. Then we'll figure it out together. The word "we" sent warmth spiraling through her chest, but it also triggered a familiar spike of anxiety. Dependence had nearly destroyed her once. Was she already preparing to trade one cage for another? The thought made her step back slightly, creating space between them that felt both necessary and devastating. Daniel seemed to understand her retreat. His hand fell away from her face, but his expression remained patient, kind. I'm not offering to rescue you, Evelyn. I'm offering to be here while you rescue yourself. Before she could respond, a sharp knock echoed through the cabin, not at the front door this time, but at the kitchen entrance. Both of them froze, listening to the sound of boots stamping snow from thick treads. "Bear," a man's voice called out, rough with cold and concern. Saw Margaret Cross tearing down the mountain road like hellfire was chasing her. "Everything all right up here?" Evelyn's blood turned to ice. Another person, a stranger who knew about her mother's visit, who'd seen her leave. The carefully contained world of this cabin was about to crack open, exposing her newfound rebellion to someone she'd never met. The old instincts kicked in with brutal efficiency. Hide, deny, make herself invisible before she could be judged. But Daniel was already moving toward the kitchen, his stride easy and unhurried. "That's Jake," he said over his shoulder. "He runs the trading post down the mountain. Good man." The casual way he said it, as if introducing her to other people was natural, expected, sent panic shooting through Evelyn's nervous system. She'd spoken to perhaps a dozen people outside her mother in the past 5 years, and always with Margaret hovering nearby, ready to intervene if the interaction went on too long or veered into dangerous territory. "I can't," she said, backing toward the living room. "I don't know how to— What do I say? How do I explain—" "Hey." Daniel stopped, turning back to her with infinite gentleness. "You don't have to explain anything to anyone. You're a grown woman who chose to wait out a storm in a safe place. That's the whole story." But it wasn't the whole story, was it? Because she was also a woman who'd just broken free from a lifetime of manipulation, who discovered newspaper clippings that suggested nothing about her existence was what it seemed, who was standing in a stranger's cabin feeling more herself than she ever had while simultaneously having no idea who that self might be. The knock came again, more insistent this time. "Bear, you in there? I've got supplies if you need them, and Sarah sent soup." Sarah. Another name, another person in Daniel's world that Evelyn knew nothing about. How many friends did he have? How many people checked on him, brought him food, cared about his welfare? The thought of a whole network of relationships existing beyond her mother's control felt both wonderful and terrifying. "What if he asks questions?" she whispered. "Then you answer them, or don't. Your choice. Your choice." The words were becoming a refrain, a reminder of something she was still learning how to believe. But as Daniel waited patiently for her decision, not moving to answer the door until she gave him permission, Evelyn felt something shift inside her chest. She was tired of hiding, tired of being afraid, tired of living as if her very existence was something shameful that needed to be concealed. "Okay," she said, straightening her shoulders. "Let him in." Daniel smiled, the first truly unguarded expression she'd seen from him, and headed for the kitchen door. As his hand reached for the latch, Evelyn realized she was about to take another step into the larger world. This time, she was choosing to take it. The door swung open on a blast of frigid air, and a man who looked like he'd been carved from the same timber as the mountains themselves. Jake was older than Daniel, maybe 50, with a graying beard and eyes that missed nothing. Snow clung to his wool coat and the edges of his knit cap, and he carried a canvas bag that smelled like Sarah's famous venison stew. Christ, it's cold enough to freeze the... Jake stopped mid-sentence as his gaze found Evelyn standing in the living room doorway. His weathered face shifted through surprise, curiosity, and something that might have been understanding before settling into careful politeness. "Sorry," he said, tugging off his cap. "Didn't realize you had company." The word company hung in the air, neutral and safe, but Evelyn could feel the weight of unasked questions behind it. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she stepped forward, acutely aware that this moment would define something important about who she was becoming. "Jake, this is Evelyn," Daniel said, his voice carrying an easy warmth that helped settle her nerves. "Evelyn, Jake runs the trading post and knows more about these mountains than any man alive." "Ma'am." Jake nodded respectfully, but his eyes were kind, crinkled at the corners from years of squinting into mountain sun. "Rough night to be traveling. Hope you found your way here before the worst of it hit." The question was gentle, giving her space to share as much or as little as she wanted. Evelyn found herself taking a breath, choosing her words carefully. "I got caught in the storm," she said, and was surprised by how steady her voice sounded. Daniel offered shelter. It was the truth, if not the whole truth, but Jake's nod suggested it was enough. "Smart man. These October blizzards can turn deadly fast." He held up the canvas bag. "Sarah made enough stew to feed half the county again. Figured you might be running low on supplies with the storm and all." "Sarah's your wife?" Evelyn asked, then immediately worried the question was too personal, too presumptuous. But Jake's face lit up with obvious affection. 23 years next month. Woman can cook like an angel and shoot straighter than most men. Lucky bastard, that's me." He glanced between Daniel and Evelyn with something that might have been approval. "She'd tan my hide if she knew I didn't invite you both down for Sunday dinner once this weather clears." The casual invitation hit Evelyn like a physical shock. Sunday dinner, with strangers who were treating her like a normal person worthy of inclusion, not a fragile creature who needed protection from the world. The magnitude of it, of being seen as someone who could accept social invitations, who could be trusted to navigate a simple meal with other people, made her throat tight. "That's very kind," she managed. "Jake," Daniel said, and there was something careful in his tone that made both of them look at him. "Margaret Cross came by tonight, looking for Evelyn, seemed upset." Jake's expression darkened immediately. "I'll bet she was. Woman's been asking questions around town for weeks. About you, specifically." He looked at Evelyn with concern. "Wanted to know who you'd been talking to, where you'd been going. Made some folks uncomfortable, if I'm being honest." The words hit Evelyn like a slap. Her mother had been monitoring her interactions with people in town, investigating her tentative attempts at independence like they were crimes requiring surveillance. "What kind of questions?" Daniel asked, his voice dangerously quiet. The kind that made Mrs. Henderson at the library think twice about letting Evelyn help with that book drive. The kind that had Tom at the post office wondering if he should mention when she picked up mail. Jake's weathered face was grim. "Your mother's got a reputation, miss, for being protective to a degree that raises eyebrows." Evelyn's cheeks burned with humiliation and anger. All those small interactions she'd treasured, helping Mrs. Henderson sort donated books, chatting with Tom about weather delays, had been tainted by her mother's interference. How many people had pulled back from her because Margaret had made them uncomfortable? How many potential friendships had been strangled in their cribs? "She told me nobody wanted to talk to me," Evelyn whispered. "That people thought I was strange, that I made them nervous." Jake's expression shifted to something dangerously close to pity. "Oh, honey, it wasn't you making anyone nervous." The validation she'd never known she needed crashed over her in waves. She wasn't the problem. She wasn't broken or unlikable or strange. Her mother had systematically destroyed her social connections while convincing her that the isolation was her own fault. "Well," Jake said after a moment, clearly sensing the emotional undercurrent, "I should get this stew to you before it freezes solid." But as he handed the bag to Daniel, he looked directly at Evelyn. "You're welcome at our table any time, miss. Sarah's always saying this mountain's too quiet, could use more good people around." More good people. As if she was already counted among them, already accepted into this community her mother had convinced her would never want her. As Jake prepared to leave, pulling his hat back on and wrapping his coat tighter, Evelyn realized she was standing on the threshold of something vast and terrifying and wonderful. A world where her presence was welcomed rather than tolerated, where she could be Evelyn Cross, not just Margaret's daughter. The approaching storm wasn't just weather anymore, it was the collision of her old life with everything she was about to become. "Wait," Evelyn said suddenly, the word escaping before she could stop it. Jake paused with his hand on the door, and both men turned to look at her. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she faced the precipice of the question that had been building since Jake mentioned her mother's inquiries around town. "The questions my mother was asking," she began, her voice barely steady. "Did anyone ever tell her they'd seen me somewhere I shouldn't have been?" Jake's weathered brow furrowed. "What do you mean, miss?" Daniel stepped closer, as if sensing the dangerous territory she was approaching. But Evelyn couldn't stop now. The need for truth was clawing at her chest, demanding answers to questions she'd been too afraid to ask. Places my mother said were off limits, people she said wouldn't want to see me. Her hands were shaking now. The old cemetery, the historical society, the newspaper archives at the library. The silence that followed felt thick enough to drown in. Jake's expression shifted from confusion to something darker, more troubled. His eyes flicked to Daniel, then back to Evelyn. "Miss," he said carefully, "I don't know what your mother's told you about those places, but there's nothing wrong with visiting them. The Historical Society's open to the public. Hell, Martha Hendricks, who runs it, is always begging for volunteers." "But the records," Evelyn pressed, her voice growing stronger despite the fear crawling up her spine. "The old newspapers, the death certificates, Evelyn Daniel's voice carried a warning she couldn't decode. But Jake was nodding slowly, understanding dawning in his weathered features. "You've been to the archives, haven't you? Found something that didn't sit right?" The question hung between them like a loaded gun. Evelyn thought of the newspaper clippings hidden in Daniel's cabin, the impossible dates, the photograph of a little girl who was supposed to be her but couldn't be, her mother's rage when she'd mentioned the Historical Society. The way Margaret's stories never quite aligned, always shifting depending on who might be listening. "Jake," Daniel said, his voice tight with something that might have been fear. "Maybe this isn't the time." "No," Evelyn interrupted, surprising herself with her vehemence. "I need to know." She looked directly at Jake, drawing on courage she didn't know she possessed. "My mother told me I was sick as a child. That's why I couldn't go to school, why I had to be tutored at home, why I couldn't be around other people. But there's no record of me at the local school. No vaccination records at Dr. Peterson's office. Nothing." Jake's face had gone pale beneath his weathered tan. He glanced again at Daniel, who stood rigid as carved stone. "There's more," Evelyn continued, the words tumbling out faster now. "Newspaper clippings about a girl who died in a fire, a girl named Evelyn Cross, age 7. But I'm here, I'm alive, and the math doesn't add up unless your mother's been lying to you for 20 years. Jake's voice was gentle but devastating. "Oh, honey, we wondered. Some of us older folks, we remembered that fire, remembered the family that died. When Margaret showed up a few years later with a daughter she claimed was named Evelyn, well," he shook his head, "people talk, but nobody wanted to believe something that awful." The cabin seemed to tilt around Evelyn. The foundation of everything she'd believed about herself was crumbling, leaving her grasping at fragments of identity that no longer made sense. Who am I? The question came out as barely a whisper. "That's what we need to figure out," Daniel said. But there was something in his voice, a guilt, a knowledge that made her turn to him sharply. You knew. It wasn't a question. You knew about the clippings, about the fire. That's why you had those newspapers. You've been investigating this. Daniel's scarred hands clenched into fists at his sides. Evelyn, I can explain. How long? Her voice was rising, hysteria creeping in at the edges. How long have you known that my entire life is a lie? The storm outside seemed to mirror the chaos in her chest. Everything she'd thought she was discovering about herself, every moment of connection with Daniel, every step toward independence. Had it all been built on his deception too? Was she just trading one manipulator for another? Since the first night you were here, Daniel admitted, the words like stones dropping into still water. I recognized you from the missing person reports. But Evelyn, you have to understand, missing person reports? The room was spinning now. I'm not missing. I'm right here. I've been here my whole life. Jake stepped forward, his face etched with compassion and something that looked like fear. Miss, if you're who I think you might be, then you've been missing for a very long time, and the people who've been looking for you, they never stopped believing you were alive. The words hit her like a physical blow. Somewhere out there, people had been searching for her. While she'd been living in isolation, convinced she was unwanted and strange, there were others who had never given up hope of finding her. Her legs gave out, and she sank onto Daniel's couch as the full magnitude of her situation crashed over her. She wasn't just discovering who she could become, she was learning that who she'd always been was a complete fabrication. The ordeal of breaking free from her mother was nothing compared to this. Now she had to face the possibility that Evelyn Cross, as she'd known herself, had never existed at all. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, filled only by the howling wind that seemed to mock the destruction happening inside the cabin. Evelyn stared at Daniel and Jake, these two men who apparently knew more about her identity than she did, and felt something vital breaking apart in her chest. Missing person reports, she repeated, her voice hollow. For how long? Jake shifted uncomfortably, his weathered hands working the brim of his knit cap. Miss, maybe you should sit down properly. This is a lot to take in. But Evelyn was already spiraling, her mind racing through every interaction she'd had over the past few days. Daniel's careful questions about her childhood, the way he'd watched her with such intensity when she'd mentioned never leaving Cedar Ridge, his insistence that she was stronger than she knew. Had that been pity? Had he been looking at her like some tragic figure whose entire existence was built on lies? You've been studying me, she said, the realization hitting her like a physical blow, like some kind of case to be solved. All those gentle questions, the way you listened so carefully to everything I said about my mother. You weren't falling for me. You were gathering evidence. That's not... Daniel started, but she cut him off. The newspaper clippings weren't random, were they? You've been researching the dead girl, trying to figure out who I really am, and I just handed you everything you needed, didn't I? Spilling my whole pathetic story like some broken little bird you found in the snow. The words tasted bitter in her mouth, but she couldn't stop them. Everything that had felt like connection, like the first real intimacy of her life, was revealed as manipulation. She'd traded her mother's lies for Daniel's investigation, thinking she was finally being seen when she was actually being analyzed. Evelyn, please. Daniel's scarred hands reached toward her, but she jerked away from his touch. It's not like that. Yes, I recognized you from the missing person reports, but what happened between us was built on deception. She stood abruptly, pacing to the window where snow continued to fall in thick, relentless sheets. You let me confess things I'd never told anyone. You made me feel safe enough to... Her voice cracked, remembering the kiss, the way she melted against him, thinking she'd finally found someone who saw her as she truly was. Everything I felt, everything I thought I was discovering about myself, it was all happening while you knew my entire identity was a lie. How is that not manipulation? Jake cleared his throat awkwardly. Miss, I think maybe I should... No. Evelyn whirled to face him, desperation sharpening her voice. You said people have been looking for me. Who? Who am I supposed to be? Jake's eyes filled with something that looked like grief. The reports were filed by your grandparents. Real ones, not whoever Margaret Cross really is. They never stopped believing you survived that house fire, even when everyone else gave up hope. Grandparents. The word hit her like a revelation and a loss all at once. She had family, real family, who had been searching for her while she'd lived 28 years believing she was completely alone in the world except for her mother. They're still alive, she whispered, far as I know. Last report I saw was maybe 6 months ago. They're old now, but they never stopped looking. The magnitude of what had been stolen from her crashed over Evelyn in waves. Not just her identity, but decades of love, of belonging, of being genuinely wanted by people who shared her blood. While she'd been isolated and convinced she was too strange for normal relationships, her real family had been grieving her loss and refusing to let her memory die. 21 years, she said, the number falling from her lips like a curse. If I was 7 when I supposedly died, I've been missing for 21 years. Daniel stepped closer, his expression anguished. Evelyn, I know this is devastating, but you're not alone anymore. We can contact them, we. The word came out sharp and bitter. There is no we, Daniel. You lied to me. You let me fall for you, while knowing I didn't even know my own name. Your feelings were real, he said desperately. Whatever else is true, what happened between us was real. I wasn't studying you, I was falling for you too. But Evelyn couldn't hear it anymore. The betrayal was too complete, the deception too vast. She'd spent her entire life being controlled and manipulated, and the first time she'd thought she was free, she'd walked straight into another web of lies. I need to leave, she said suddenly, heading toward the kitchen where her coat still hung by the door. I need to get out of here. You can't go out in this storm, Jake protested. It's suicide weather. But Evelyn was already pulling on her coat, her movements sharp and desperate. She couldn't stay here, surrounded by the ruins of everything she'd thought she was building. She couldn't look at Daniel's face and see the pity there, the knowledge of just how completely her life had been destroyed. The storm outside seemed preferable to the devastation within.